I'm Duncan Faraday. I'm a faculty member in English and American Studies here at the Graduate Center and a member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. And it's my pleasure to introduce our two guests this afternoon. And I'm just going to introduce you both very briefly, and then we can get to it in the order that you'll speak. Kayama Glover is Professor of French and Africana Studies at Barnard College, the author of Haiti Unbound, A Spiralist Challenge to the Postcolonial Canon, co-editor of Paradoxes of the Postcolonial Feminine for Yale French Studies in 2016. She has crafted several translations. Most recently is translating Francois Vergès's The Wombs of Women, Capitalism, Racialization, and Feminism for Duke University Press. She's an awardee of the Panheim Foundation, the National Endowments for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Mellon Foundation. She's the founding co-editor of the journal SX?
SX, yeah.
I think it was Archipelagos, a small acts platform for digital practice, which is an amazing project, and founding co-director of the Digital Humanities Project in the same boats toward an Afro-Atlantic intellectual cartography. Her most recent monograph, Disorderly Women on Caribbean Community and the Ethics of Self-Regard, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. This year, and this is an amazingly titled space.
Come on.
She is currently a fellow at the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris.
Am I going, and then you introduce him, or are you doing both of us?
Okay, good.
Yes, okay. So I could do this sitting down, but I have one slide, so for that I shall stand. Thank you so much, Gary, for inviting me to be a part of this. I already have had a number of ideas for work I'm doing now come from the conversations this morning, and I look forward to hearing much more for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Lindsay. You keep being out of the room or not listening when people are thanking you, but thank you so much for all the hard work you did getting me over here and organized, so I appreciate it enormously. So over the course of the next few minutes, I just want to talk to you all about the stakes and the practice of translating into English an Afro-diasporic text written in French. Specifically, I'm going to take you through some of the imbricated layers of translation involved in bringing renowned Haitian author René de Pestre, his prize-winning 1988 novel Adriana dans tous mes rêves, Adriana in All My Dreams, first into the space of metropolitan France, and then to an Anglophone reading public. So Adriana was the third novel that I'd translated, and in many ways the most challenging. More than either of my other translations, with Adriana, I found myself having to grapple with what it meant to translate Haiti itself into a world that tends to view that country through the lens of demeaningly racialized difference. In putting together my remarks for today, my point of departure was really writer and translator John Keane's call for more substantive reflection on race across diverse cultural frameworks. In a truly beautifully written reflection, an essay called Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, Keane argues that to translate Blackness in its various iterations and geocultural contexts might work to make plain the contingency and the specificity of race as lived experience, and further, might serve to push against homogenizing US-centric conceptions of what Blackness actually represents. And every time I say Blackness, imagine scare quotes, but I just can't do this the whole time I'm going to be talking, so. All right, so Keane writes, quote, "Were more Black voices translated, we would have a clearer sense of the connections and commonalities, as well as the differences across the African diaspora, and better understand an array of regional, national, and hemispheric issues," end quote. So of course, there's no such thing as a global Black experience. On the contrary, diverse and divergent colonial and post-colonial histories have produced heterogeneous Black geographies, epistemologies, cultures, and languages, rendering Black peoples in important ways illegible to one another. And so it's with this in mind that I want to consider the geocultural site symbol that is the Haitian Republic, a place whose Blackness continues to be seen as uniquely pathological. It has to be said, Haiti is Black in a special kind of way. Yes, it's as foundationally Afro-diasporic as its other Caribbean neighbors, but it's long been disparaged by the particular racialized denigration of its popular religion. Basically, the idiosyncrasy of Haiti's Blackness has everything to do with degrading perceptions and representations of Vodou. The perception of Vodou in the global north marks a clear case of what Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolph-Trouillot has identified as the deployment of culture to euphemize the idea of race. North Atlantic discourse concerning Haiti continuously casts the country as fundamentally stunted by its Afro-spiritual practices. And insofar as theories of cultural difference equate more and less transparently with theories of race, the stigmatizing of Vodou as cultural practice is unequivocally racial. Translating this, quote, voodoo nation into the wider world thus becomes a matter of ethics and, more obliquely, a matter of politics. So Haiti presents what I think of as a high-stakes example of Blackness in need of translation. But not just any kind of translation. Haiti needs translation as a potential tool or site of articulation. That is, as Brent has written, actually, leaning on Stuart Hall, translation must serve as, quote, a process of linking or connecting across gaps, and it's from Practicing a Diaspora. A process of, quote, or a conception rather of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference. So translating Adriana Dans tous mes rêves was for me such a potential discourse of diaspora, a destigmatizing effort that might place an alternative narrative of Haitian Vodou into circulation in the global north. Following Keane, I've understood translating Haitian literature from French into English as a means, however modest, of creating space for an expanded notion of Blackness within the wider African diaspora. So before I get to the novel, just a few words on René Depestre himself, for those of you who aren't familiar with him. A very brief few words, but he's got a great and long, wonderful story that I'm telling currently in a biography I'm writing of him. So Depestre, born in 1926, he left Haiti at the age of 19 after launching a national political transformation, overthrowing essentially a government in 1946. And he was more or less, it's a very reductive version of the story you can imagine, but he was more or less exiled from Haiti at the age of 19 in 1946 and spent the following 30 years traveling around the world and engaged in militant socialist activism throughout the West, throughout Eastern Europe, South America, East Asia, and the Caribbean, including 20 years in Cuba. So in Cold War Cuba, he arrived in 58 and he left in 78. And all during this time, he was writing poetry, prose fiction, and political essays. And he's 92 years old now, he's still writing, and he lives quietly in the south of France. Now, throughout his lifelong wanderings, Depestre has always sought to reach an audience situated well beyond the space of his native Haiti. Be it in his capacity as poet, novelist, or essayist, he's written consistently for a public situated outside of Haiti, presenting his island always to another, wider global space. And so he's long been preoccupied with the power differential that places him on the margins of a world order he's been seeking to upset. He's long understood that staging his desired interventions demands a sustained practice of cultural translation. Depestre's extra-insular intentions are as apparent in his poetry and prose fiction as they are in his political writings, and Adriana is no exception. This novel foregrounds the fantastical and the erotic within a frame that opens onto the Atlantic world, but from a markedly Haitian perspective. And on its publication in 1988, it sold almost 200,000 copies and won a number of awards, including the very prestigious Prix Renaudot in France, among many others. But the thing is, the popular success of the novel in many ways reflected and revealed the racialized projections and exoticist desires of the French reading public. Reviewers in France encouraged readers to, quote, let themselves go, to immerse themselves in the fiery land of zombies, and to embrace the deflowerings, aphrodisiac emanations, sexual exploits, forbidden ecstasies, and irresistible sorcery of the Haitian folk. So this was that's a paraphrasing of a series of reviews that came out around 1988 to 1989 around this novel. And so despite, or probably more likely, well, yeah, because of the terms of the novel's acclaim in France, Adriana has been subject to a great deal of criticism among academics, particularly in the global north, i.e. in the US, Canada, and in France as well, really from the moment of its publication. Because where French reviewers and award givers were rejoicing in the escapist fantasies that Depestre's tropical narrative allowed them, Caribbeanist scholars in the US, etc., have accused Depestre of exploiting Haitian culture as an exotic commodity. A commodity, obviously, for European consumption. And this has to do not only with the novel itself, but also with the circumstances of its production. The fact that Depestre wrote Adriana while living in the heart of the French countryside after turning away in the 1970s from overt militancy has left him especially vulnerable to critical interrogation around questions of authenticity and political commitment. So the fact that he sort of abandoned the socialist revolution in 1978 and turned to writing fiction primarily, he also abandoned more or less poetry and started writing novels with this, kind of strong erotic charge and always talking about Haiti in a certain kind of way that I'll talk about later, has meant that he has been sort of called to task and even accused of selling out to global markets for world literature. And it's true, certainly, that Adriana in Tous mes rêves tells a Haitian story to a non-Haitian audience. The novel is marked linguistically, structurally, and narratively by efforts to translate Haiti into a wider Francophone space. Published in France by the prestigious Éditions Gallimard, Adriana necessarily belongs to this fraught category of world literature, a network of literary works that's ultimately embedded within the canons and the hierarchies created by North American and European imperial nation-states. Explicit elements of the novel attest to Depestre's attentiveness, at least in part, to a non-Haitian readership. There is, for example, the extensive glossary at the end of it of Haitian terms in Creole, which are placed as this appendix. And the thing about it is that the glossed words in this appendix mainly refer to terms and things related to Vodou, and so belong to a Haitian Creole lexicon. But in rendering the terms in the glossary, he has rendered them orthographically in French, so thus legible to a French reading public. And it's also worth noting that Depestre strategically deploys epigraphs throughout his novel. His opening citation consists of lines from a poem by French writer René Char, and is then followed immediately in the text by an allusion to a well-known novel by French surrealist intellectual André Breton. And then also the sections and chapters of Adriana are framed with epigraphs by James Joyce, Victor Hugo, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and even Sophocles. So Depestre makes use of these epigraphs to situate his novel subtly, but insistently, within a predominantly European canon. He's clearly concerned both with Adriana's linguistic legibility and with the novel's positioning vis-a-vis the orders of value that consecrate the literary on a global scale. And so, of course, this is the context within which Depestre has been subject to disapproval, critiqued for his perceived consent to, if not collusion with, the racist and ethnocentric fetishizing of cultural otherness mobilized by former and current metropolitan centers of the North Atlantic that circumscribe and exploit the global South. And this is obviously a critical response that is bound up in anxieties regarding what theorist Graham Huggan has labeled the, quote, post-colonial exotic. Huggan's concept outlines the recuperative tendencies of the Western literary institution, its capacity to absorb and domesticate difference as it consumes it. Now, post-colonial writers are often called on to translate their foreignness for institutions, industries, and consumers situated primarily in the global North, and doing so can be extremely tricky. Independent of an author's purpose or desire, a text can be easily co-opted as an exotic good, which leaves global South writers in something of a bind. How do you represent, say, island culture without sensationalizing it, reifying existing racial stereotypes, or censoring its idiosyncrasies in the interest of rendering it more palatable to a world that denies its value? How do you present non-Western culture to the West for consumption without betraying that culture in the process? There's a fine line, it's true, between opening a window onto othered cultures and playing to stereotypes for commercial gain, and this is arguably a line Depestre might be said to walk in Adriana. In chronicling the adventures of a pretty French girl who gets turned into a zombie, Depestre admittedly does not shy away from representing the pathologies of Haitian Vodou. He incorporates the unsavory dimensions of Haiti's religious practices, and he invites an interrogation of Vodou's ambivalence around matters of race and gender by including sort of over-the-top elements like evil black magic sorcerers, sex-crazed hybrid butterfly men, and yes, zombies. He does risk affirming Western stereotypes about Afro-diasporic religion. But by the same token, Depestre takes care, I would argue, and will argue, to portray the intricacies of Vodou as epistemology, as aesthetic, and as faith. At about the midpoint of his novel, for example, Depestre's narrator protagonist, Patrick Altamont, who is a character whose biography actually maps very neatly onto Depestre's own, and which has also opened the door for a great deal of criticism of the novel, wherein sort of there's a conflation of who Depestre is as a writer and who his character is, who speaks in the first person. It's another story that I tell in my book. So at the midpoint of the novel, he presents a veritable anthropological treatise on the zombie myth in Haiti and global history, and it's titled Prolegomena to a Dead-End Essay. It's a long passage that lays out 9 propositions that address the intersections between North Atlantic racism, global capitalism, and the philosophical purchase of Haitian cultural expression. At this point, and then elsewhere in the novel, de Pestre's overtly outward-facing authorial gestures demand that Haitian Vodou be taken seriously as a knowledge system and a worldview. His narrator's thoughtful meditation on the mechanisms and philosophies of Haitian spirituality work to counterbalance and contextualize the more titillating portrayals of Vodou in the novel. And then the passages where Patrick, the narrator, explicates the intricacies of the zombie's juridical and legislative embeddedness in Haitian society, for example, or his staging of Vodou and Catholic rituals as equally valid and valued in the Haitian community, these all serve to establish Vodou's complexity and its real social legitimacy. Also, just as de Pestre unabashedly represents Vodou's erotic investments, its preoccupation, yes, with blood and death, its hypervaluation of whiteness and its misogynist tendencies, he also gives us its practices of healing, its nourishment of the communal, and its insistence on joy and possibility. So what he's doing also, to my mind, is he leaves to his reader the responsibility for recognizing that these kinds of dualities inform all religious teachings, be they Vodou or the more sanctioned faith of global religion, faiths of global religions. Okay, so how does my translation fit into all of this? Well, if de Pestre's novel offered a translation of Afro-Haitian culture to a non-Haitian Francophone audience in the 1980s, leaning as it did right into the whirl of complexities surrounding the global image of Haitian Vodou, my translation of Adriana proposed carrying both Haiti's culture and languages across to a new target reading public 30 years later. So as an Afro-American woman of Caribbean descent, I'd say I kept in mind, or front of mind really, 3 specific engagements in assuming my task as a translator. First, translating responsibly within the current maelstrom of narratives about Haiti and Blackness or Vodou, right? So Pat Robertson, Donald Trump, shithole countries, et cetera, et cetera. Second, I thought hard about translating to and for a very particular Afro-diasporic readership, and I'll talk about a little later. And then third, I thought a lot about remaining attentive to the actual packaging of my translation, and that's going to be the one slide that I show you. So let me say it plainly. The translator of Haitian literature must always be thinking hard about politics. What translation theorist Susan Bassnett has identified very eloquently, I think, as, quote, the politics of translating and the ethnocentric violence that sometimes accompanies it, end quote. If done successfully, translating the work of post-colonial Black writers reveals the diversity of Black experiences on a global scale, but if not, there can be more and less direct consequences regarding global policies towards peoples in so-called Black nations. Failures of cultural translation create hierarchies of value wherein lesser shithole countries are misread as lacking or deficient, deemed worthy or not of protection from harm. In the case of Haiti is a stark instance of the ways translation informs the discourses that determine which Black lives matter, and relatedly, the success or failure of policies and practices that have an explicit impact on those lives. The power differential between Haiti and countries like this one that have been so imbricated in Haiti's social, political, and artistic institutions makes the question of translation less one of inequality between languages, as is often the case between minor and major languages, let's say, and more one of inequality between cultures. The most pernicious and obvious basis for the hierarchical diminishing of Haiti hinges on the matter of race. Exceptional and absolute, Haiti's Blackness, again a Blackness that is fundamentally linked to Vodou, Haiti's Blackness marks its every interaction with the world beyond its borders. As cultural theorist Stuart Hall rightly argues, it's crucial not only to identify ways in which, and here I'm paraphrasing, ways in which economic structures are relevant to racial divisions, but also to consider how the two, the economic and the racial, are theoretically connected. The first task is to attend to, quote, the specificity of those social formations that comport distinctive racial or ethnic characteristics, what Hall names, quote, this something else that translates backward and forward between the social, racial, and the economic. So in thinking about Adriana, I think about Vodou as an instance of that something else, that thing that translates between the social, racial, and the economic. It's an ostensibly extra economic factor, but that to a large extent determines Haiti's legibility to the outside world. Vodou is a cipher through which much of the nation's political and economic struggles have been read, especially in the United States. Vodou has been aggressively fashioned and thus widely perceived as an obstacle to Haiti's development. From aid organizations to the news media to the Hollywood film industry, Haitian Vodou, or Voodoo, O-O-O-O, as its so-called US-American translation, is consistently deployed to signal Haiti's perceived backwardness and dysfunction. And ever since the word voodoo came into wide use in an English lexicon, the label has served to disparage Haitians. It's been used to evoke evil and brutality, sexual excess and depravity. And it's had significant purchase in the US in mediatizations of Haiti's supposed ungovernability and propensity for disaster. We heard a lot about voodoo in the wake of the earthquake of 2010, for example. The translation of Haitian Vodou into voodoo in English has been a highly politicized matter for the past several decades. Since 2011, Haitian and Haitianist scholars and practitioners of Vodou have petitioned various prominent media institutions to dissociate the term voodoo from Haitian spiritual practices by adjusting their style sheets. And this effort has been largely met with indifference. There's been some limited success, but for the most part, there's been a marked refusal to make that change. And what's more, insensitivity to the negative force of O-O-O voodoo has been an issue in the domain of literary translation as well. The 2015 publication of Haitian novelist Ketli Marz's Saison Sauvage, Savage Seasons in English, is a very troubling instance of this phenomenon. The novel's talented, decorated, well-known translator Janine Herman made and has since defended the decision to render Vodou as voodoo in the English text. And when she was asked about that choice in a published interview, Herman explained that after thinking, quote, long and hard about voodoo versus Vodou, she and her editor, quote, finally decided voodoo seemed more accessible. Herman went on to say, quote, I thought voodoo priestess had a nice ring to it, something almost Baudelarian about it. So no, right? It'd be funny if it weren't so not funny. But the insouciance of Herman's rationalization suggests, at best, an unawareness of the real stakes of her choices. At worst, her position echoes a long history of cultural and racial condescension and North Atlantic supremacy. Now, granted, Herman readily acknowledges that she had little to no familiarity with Haiti or its cultural and political realities prior to translating Marz's novel. But this is distressing in and of itself. Herman's admitted absence of cultural sensitivity due to lack of information about the source context is ultimately a function of the US publisher's relative unconcern with the fact of Haiti's precarity on the global stage. The careless assertion that the term voodoo is currently most accessible begs two critical questions. One, what Anglophone audience is the novel meant to interpolate? And two, what pedagogic and ethical responsibility do the translator and the publisher bear? So these questions bring me to my second point of entanglement in approaching the translation of Depestre's novel, the matter of audience. Haiti is arguably as foreign to non-Haitian Afro-diasporic communities in the US and elsewhere as it is to Europeans and non-Black Americans. Although largely marginalized as second-class citizens within their national context, Afro-diasporic consumers of first-world media have been necessarily influenced by anti-Haitian stereotypes of Vodou. US American Blacks especially are situated by virtue of their nationality, albeit ostensibly and precariously, US American Blacks are situated on the privileged side of the developed, underdeveloped, imperialist, colonialized divide. And so what this means is that they don't necessarily, or we don't necessarily recognize Haitians as political and cultural kin. Afro-diasporic populations in the Anglophone Caribbean also have tended to see Haitians as less than. Though geographically proximately and arguably racially allied with Haitians, Afro-Anglophone communities throughout the Americas have remained in many ways distanced from the Black Republic. And in addition to Anglophone Afro-diasporic populations in the US and wider Americas, there was a second audience I was aiming for with my translation of Ariana: Anglophone and Creolophone Haitian communities outside of Haiti, communities that by reason of global imperialism and its long wake have been separated from their francophonie, right? So as a result, cut off from their rightful cultural patrimony. Teaching Caribbean literature here in New York has brought me into contact with many students like this, first-generation Haitian Americans who read and write in English and not in French. And so all this to say, I just wanted to sort of highlight the fact that in translating Depestre, I really was thinking of diverse micro-readerships within the Anglo or the Afro-Anglo sphere, to make the point, if it isn't obvious, that our audiences as translators are far from homogeneous, even if the language we're translating into we imagine in some ways as being a language. Now, targeting these two readerships, one non-Haitian, non-Francophone Afro-Americans in the largest sense of the term, and then two non-Francophone Haitians posed a particular challenge as well, right? Because whereas both audiences could access the novel in the English language, their understanding of Haitian culture was, of course, going to be very different. So part of my work involved balancing an effort to make certain culturally specific realities comprehensible on the one hand, but then also to maintain the very opacity that de Pestre would have meant to signal resistance or critique in minority cultural literature toward a dominant culture. So the work that he would have been trying to do in French vis-a-vis a French reading public. So how to kind of work those two angles in the translation. And so having this fact in mind as part of the process of translating de Pestre's novel, and a novel I was, of course, essentially turning into a commodity for consumption in the English-speaking world, this most motivated me to be very lucid regarding my intention and my responsibility to the source text, as well as to the source culture. In translating Adriana, I had to worry about what translation theorist Maria Timoczko calls, quote, the dilemma of faithfulness. That is, the question of what to do with, quote, factors that are particularly problematic for the receiving audience, end quote. Timoczko explains that to be faithful, quote, such problematic factors must be transposed despite the difficulties they might cause to the sensibilities or cognitive framework of translator or audience. So Vodou was obviously one of these potentially problematic factors. My choice of the word Vodou itself marked a definitive stance vis-a-vis the ethics of representing Haiti in foreign spaces, okay. But even beyond that decision, the novel posed the challenge of representing Vodou culture in translation. I knew full well that de Pestre's unabashed incorporation of local color in Adriana might allow certain readers, including Black American and non-Haitian Caribbean readers, might allow those readers to find a certain home for their prejudices. But still, I had to resist overstepping my authority as translator and somehow sanitizing de Pestre's novel in deference to the relatively Puritan culture of the Anglosphere. Adriana contains several highly erotic scenes, including descriptions of sexual encounters between Adriana and various male and female partners, as well as evocations of the explicit sensuality and sexuality of Vodou. So for the most part, I tried to follow the source text, the lead that kind of de Pestre had lent to the spirit of the text, which was humorous and ribald, certainly. I did my best to identify English terms that would render the extravagance of de Pestre's comic register, and that meant I know far too many words for penis in English at this point, and many other parts of the human body. But this brings me to the last of the three factors that preoccupied me as I translated Adriana. Beyond the lexical decision-making around Vodou and the question of the interests and capacities of my personally desired audiences, my other interventions as translator had to do with the literal packaging of de Pestre's novel for the Anglophone world. What kind of frame would I put around it in order to interpolate a readership, but not necessarily titillate a readership? And this was it was a hard line to walk, because obviously this was something that was not only in my control, but in that of publishers as well. I had to find a publisher I could trust to do justice to the novel's deep anchoring in Haitian culture without betraying that culture by pandering to the potentially racist presumptions of the non-Haitian reading public. Right, so I didn't want to spend my time basically fighting the Vodou voodoo question with any press or fending off marketers eager to put like a zombie on the cover or something. And so I spent more than 2 very frustrating years shopping this translation. And I was really surprised that had to be the case. I began optimistically by approaching an imprint of a major international press that had recently published a Haitian novel in translation. And the response was disappointing, but also encouraging. The editors found the translation compelling, quote, masterful even, but they thought the genetic instability of the novel made it more suitable for an independent press, which is fair enough because the novel has in it, as I mentioned, that anthropological treatise in the middle of it. It's got like a newspaper article in it, a couple of love letters. So it's a weird-looking novel, maybe not for, bestseller consumption, whatever that means. But I understood that critique. So undaunted, I then approached editors at 2 independent presses, both of whom found the book fascinating, quote, but too challenging for a casual reader. I was like, really? Okay. So the novel definitely wasn't African-American fiction, and its presentation of a white heroine on a black island was thorny. And one of them actually asked me, so what's the publishing hook for the novel? I was like, I didn't know. I mean, it's a great novel. That apparently is insufficient for marketing language, at least for those presses. So they suggested that I reach out to an academic press. Okay, no problem. Cool. Undaunted, still undaunted, I did that. But this option too came to naught. Even with my proposed critical introduction attached and strong praise for the translation, Adriana's presentation of the exotic and the erotic made the editor nervous about reception among the press's academic readership. Okay, so by now I was thoroughly daunted. This was not going well at all. We were about a year and a half in, and I didn't really, I just didn't understand why it was that this novel, which had won prizes, which was really well received and highly acclaimed among major figures in Haitian literature, i.e. current writers in Haiti and in the Haitian diaspora, and by the way, had been translated into 7 other languages, right? So how was it that this could be of so little interest to English language publishers? Stymied by this question, I just kind of chalked it up to Americans being too Puritan to handle it. And I mean, maybe that was sour grapes or whatever, but I did come up with a strategy, which amounted to reaching out to Edwidge Danticat. Edwidge Danticat. I asked Edwidge whether she'd consider writing a foreword for the translation. And her response, quote, "Whatever you need, my dear, I really love that book." Her response set me back on track, and not just because I knew that it would facilitate getting it translated, but I have to say I was in somewhat of a crisis of confidence as to whether this book should be out in the Anglophone world. Like maybe it was just too dated, or maybe Me Too meant that these kinds of things couldn't reliably or reasonably be expected to circulate the way they might have done 30 years ago. But her response meant a lot on a lot of levels, I would say. Now, when it comes to so-called marginal literature, the right preface can really make all the difference. As Richard Watts has written, a preface can serve both to, quote, move the merchandise and, quote, to signal the quality, seriousness, and perhaps even political orientation of the text in question. Famously respected and even beloved by both Haitians and non-Haitians, by both scholars and Oprah Winfrey, Edwidge Danticat was the ideal shepherd for Adriana in the Afro-Anglosphere. She won, she was in Oprah's Book Award thing for her first novel, so very much in marketing terms. But more importantly, her own work is renowned for its sensitive treatment of gender and transnational Blackness, and so I knew she'd be perfectly placed to vouch for Adriana's value on these fronts. The very presence of her name on the book's front cover would attest to the legitimacy of the novel's intent and accomplishment. Now for my PowerPoint slide. Oh, damn it. Okay. It's not that big of a deal. Is it showing up as like a, yeah. Okay. I could use a tech assist. I can narrate it what it looks like. So what's on the screen right now? It's just blue, okay. I could, all right, if I had the book too. All right, stay tuned. There'll be a big reveal. Anyway. All right, here we go. Okay, so I'll talk about this just for 2 seconds, then I'm done. The elegant preface that Danticat ended up providing did just that. It contextualizes, educates, and reassures. It exercises a measure of control, enjoining the reader to look beyond the superficially exotic, to think about the deeper meanings inscribed in the narrative. Danticat's preface highlights Adriana's at once universal and insular scope, its invitations and its refusals. She offers guidance without preachiness, explanation without condescension. Her foreword is, in and of itself, a very graceful instance of translation. Danticat's paratextual imprimatur secured, name on cover, or name foreseen for cover, I went on to pitch this project with renewed confidence. My target this time was Akashic Books, the publishers, which is a well-reputed and widely admired small publishing house. Their catalog categorically confirms the press's deep commitment to Afro-diasporic literatures. Their list features multiple titles related to race and U.S. American frame, including works by Amiri Baraka and Melvin Van Peebles, as well as a wide-ranging and extensive list of important titles by Caribbean writers, including Elizabeth Nunez, Colin Channer, Marlon James, and of course, Danticat herself. The presence of these living authors in Akashic's catalog, several of whom write their islands from the vantage point of the continental US, this did the work of vetting the press for me. I felt sure that Adriana would be handled with care. Akashic's carefulness in fashioning the post-colonial package of my translation shows in the details of the frame placed around the published manuscript. So Dante Cat's foreword does the work of situating the novel. There is no critical introduction. It's meant to be a popular book. And then, of course, there's a short translator's note, which lays out my conception of the translation as an intervention. So some of the things that I talked about, of who the desired audience was and what I hoped the translation would do in the world. And it speaks directly in that little note to my desired readership. Last, and perhaps most important from a commercial perspective, there's the cover art, the paratextual element most viscerally responsible for interpolating potential readers. For Hadriana's cover, Akashic proposed, and this was their idea, and I was so grateful and relieved. It's an image both evocative and respectful of Haitian Vodou, of Haitian Blackness. The design, as you can see, is at once, I think, aesthetically arresting, but also a perfect staging of the story it introduces. What you see here are stylizations of Haitian veve, and these are sacred symbols of Haitian Vodou spirituality. The veve form a pattern of a muted background and are integrated also into the typeface of the book's title. These symbols present an opacity that is both invitation and refusal. They appeal differently to initiated and uninitiated reader alike, and not unlike the novel, I would say, in many ways. So to conclude, I just will say that Henri de Pestre has been celebrated as much for his kind of wanderings back and forth across the globe in bold pursuit of political justice and racial equality as for his deep commitment to Haitian culture as source of aesthetic beauty and creative inspiration. But at the same time, he's been much criticized for unguardedly presenting aspects of that culture, its Afro-spirituality, its ebullient erotic expressiveness, presenting those aspects for consumption by people likely to disdain such cultural traits. To translate de Pestre's French into English has meant being caught up in this contradiction. It's meant facing the risks inherent in extracting Haiti's Blackness from its original Francophone context and presenting it mediated and repackaged, carrying it over cautiously into the English-speaking world. Thank you for listening. Oh, yeah, that's out. That's out, yeah. Been out. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Aside from that
That's why the
question, we're going to
markets do
hold
more.
the rest of the questions
Gotta do better.
and have a joint conversation. But it's my pleasure to introduce Brent Hayes Edwards, Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, the author, I'm sure you're aware, of Epistrophes, Jazz and the Literary Imagination, Practice of Diaspora, Literature Translation, and the Rise of Black Internationalism, and with Robert G. O'Malley and Farah Jasmine Griffin, the co-editor of the collection Uptown Conversation, The New Jazz Studies. His research and teaching focused on topics including African-American literature, Francophone literature, theories of the African diaspora, translation studies, archive theory, Black radical historiography, cultural poetics in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s, surrealism, experimental poetics, and jazz. He was the co-editor for 10 years of Social Text, is also a member of the editorial boards of Transition and Callaloo, and also directs the Scholars in Residence program at the Schomburg. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to show images, but I'll put them up when I get there. I want to start by also, as others have done, thanking Gary and the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. And Lindsay keeps running out of the room when people want to thank her, but thanking Lindsay for the logistics and helping move us through the day. We did not plan, although we did just see each other in Paris last week at the wonderfully named Ideas and Imagination Institute. But our talks actually go surprisingly well together. I guess this is the practice panel. So I'll just, no, I'll wait and I'll just plug my computer in. My talk is called Diasporic Literature and the Task of the Black Translator. In a number of his later works, the Martinican writer and theorist Edouard Glissant makes a perplexing and seemingly paradoxical argument that, as he puts it, this is a long quote, "We know that we write in the presence of all the languages in the world, even if we don't know any of them. To take myself as an example, I'm impregnated, poetically impregnated with this necessity, even though I have terrible difficulty speaking any language other than the ones I use, Creole and French. But to write in the presence of all the languages of the world does not mean to know all the languages in the world. It means that in the current context of literatures and of the relationship of the poetic to the world in chaos, le chaos monde, I can no longer write in a monolingual way. This is to say that I deport my own tongue. I shake it up, not in syntheses, but in linguistic openings that allow me to conceive of the relationships of languages with each other today on the surface of the earth. Relationships of domination, complicity, absorption, oppression, erosion, tangency, etc. As the fact of an immense drama, an immense tragedy from which my own tongue cannot be exempt or spared. And consequently, I cannot write my language in a monolinguistic manner. I write in the presence of this tragedy, in the presence of this drama. This is a passage, and he says this in different ways in a number of his later works. That was my translation of one of his untranslated later works, Introduction à une poétique du vers. It's a passage that I like to sit with and think about what that means. What does it mean to write in the presence of all the languages of the world? For Glissant, it means, first of all, that we must recognize what he calls the internal multiplicity of languages, the fact that any given language is not one coherent closed system, but instead a semiotic network open to, infiltrated by other networks, whatever the extent to which they coalesce, more often than not by force, as a putative national language. In her slim but incisive recent book, Not Like a Native Speaker, Ray Chow likewise attacks the very notion of the monolingual and adds that despite the trauma and violence of the confrontation among languages inherent in colonialism, it's in fact the colonial situation in which an imperial power imposes its language on the populations it subjugates as the very vehicle of its political and cultural authority, that provides the most potent historical demonstration of the error of presuming a natural link between a given people and a mother tongue. Chow adds a piquant corollary that despite the long tradition of anti- and post-colonial resistance to the imposed metropolitan language and to the epistemic violence of colonial education overall, from another perspective, she writes, quote, the colonial situation has, if unwittingly, conferred upon the colonized the privilege of a certain prescience, the grasp of how artificially and artifactually, rather than naturally, language works and can work in the first place, end of quote. So when Glissant says that he can no longer write in a monolingual way, what he means is that in the wake of colonialism, it's a ruse to pretend that anyone can be a native speaker of any tongue in some inviolate, untroubled sense. This may still sound confusing, but it's not too hard to see what Glissant means, even in the course of the passage where he's making this claim. On the following page in the same book, for instance, he goes on to describe the implications of the state of affairs for the practice of literary analysis, writing that, again quoting Glissant, it is all the more urgent to carefully untangle moments of diglossia. Opacities must be preserved, an appetite for opportune obscurity in translation must be created, and falsely convenient vehicular sabirs must be relentlessly refuted. The framework is not made of transparency, and it is not enough to assert one's right to linguistic difference, or conversely, to interlexicality, to be sure of realizing them, end of quote. Let me just highlight one part of that passage. The word sabir, S-A-B-I-R, is a French word, not marked off or italicized in Glissant's text, but not originally so. And a French reader might well wonder at the etymology of this peculiar proper noun. It's derived from a deformation of the Spanish verb saber, to know, in the mid-19th century. In other words, in the period when French imperialism was in direct competition with Spanish imperialism over regions of influence in Morocco and elsewhere, the loan word came to mean a particular sort of linguistic mixture. A sabir, and it's to think of the irony that the verb to know comes to stand in for this. A sabir, that is, refers to a kind of lingua franca, a composite pidgin mixing words from Arabic, Italian, Spanish, and French that came to be spoken in North Africa and the Levant. It's a utilitarian speech with poorly defined grammatical structure and a thin lexicon, something less regularized than a Creole. So sabir is a word misheard from one language to another, one might say, that points to the ways languages are always crossing paths and interpenetrating. In other words, even within standard French, quote unquote, there are knots like this. the remnants or residue of the way French has come into contact with and been infiltrated by multiple other tongues in an unending fugue. Ray Chow calls this realm the xenophone, in which reading beyond the monolingual can reveal what she calls, quote, a creative domain of languaging emerging, a domain that draws its sustenance from mimicry and adaptation and bears in its accent the murmur, the passage of diverse found speeches, end of quote. For Glissant, this sort of daring reading practice does not result in transparency, but in opacity, going back to the quote I started with. It does not provide the assurance of an anchored genealogy, but instead teaches us of the uncertain. It's a way of thinking with the lightest touch, he says, la pensée même de l'effleurement. To trace among languages, he writes, is to trace within the unpredictability of what is from now on our common condition. There's a lot to say about Glissant on translation. I think he's one of the major theorists of translation, although a lot of his work on translation isn't translated, unfortunately. If Glissant frames this point, first of all, as an issue of writing and reading practice, the question I want to highlight here has to do with the implications of this argument about writing in the presence of all the languages of the world for the practice of translation in African diasporic literature. What does it mean to translate from this perspective? Glissant's formulation may seem reminiscent, that lightest touch idea, of Walter Benjamin's famous argument that a translation is a sort of tangent that touches the original fleetingly and only at the infinitely small point of sense. But one could argue, to return to the example I've given in Glissant's own prose with Sabir, that to attend to the muted interlingualism of a word like Sabir is to attend to semantic multiplicity or overlay rather than reduction or restriction. In turning to two examples from my own work as translator, I'm not going to insist that this task is solely a matter of translating multilingualism in one matter or another by pointing to the ways that translating diasporic literature inherently means translating with an ear to traces of uprooting and displacement in language, in a practice attentive to the political valences of vernaculars, creoles, and code switching. I teach a class at Columbia, I've now taught it 3 times, called Comparative Diasporas and Translation with my colleague who translates from contemporary Greek, Karen Van Dyke, in the classics department, and we try to think of translation studies from the perspective of diaspora in precisely that way. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Instead, I'm going to try to do something a little more difficult. I'm going to try to attempt to expand on Glissant's point in 2 directions, in terms of the task of translating for the opacity of what we might call the historical flux between problem spaces, on the one hand, and in terms of translating for prior acts of translation, on the other. Both of those will sound cryptic, but hopefully I'll be able to explain what I mean. Now I will plug in. Is there something there? Yes. Okay. In collaboration with Eve Giannoncelli, an intellectual historian of French feminism, I'm currently in the process of assembling as complete a collection as possible of the articles published in Interwar Paris by the Martinican writer and translator Paulette Nardal, whom I hope we've learned to recognize as one of the giants of the pre-negritude period. Over the past decade or so, I've found a significant number of articles by Nardal during her Paris period, articles that have not been discussed or even cited in any of the existing scholarship so far. While running throughout the decade of the 1930s, these writings fill out the Nardal bibliography most strikingly at 2 points. First, with a large number of articles on Antillean women she published in 1930 to 1931, and this is one of these, called L'Antillaise. It's actually a series of 5 articles. If you can't see it, maybe you can see it now, that is a photo of cross-dressers in Fort-de-France. Yes, that says les Martiniquaises en travesti dans une représentation à bord d'un paquebot. She doesn't write about this in the article, unfortunately, but that's the illustration of the article. They're fascinating. In other words, these come between her first writings in La Dépêche Africaine in 1928 and her founding of La Revue du Monde Noir in 1931. And second, what I'm going to talk about today, with an important group of works in 1936, when her thinking was shaped by her role as a pivotal figure in coordinating efforts among Black intellectuals in France, the UK, and the US to influence international debate in the wake of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. As early as the summer of 1935, she helped to found a Comité de défense de l'Éthiopie in Paris that served as a sort of clearinghouse for these efforts. After Mussolini's troops crossed the border in October 1935, much of her writing and political activity was aimed at bringing attention to the Ethiopian plight. The Italo-Ethiopian conflict, Nardal wrote in one of these pieces, wrenched, again, there are a series of these pieces in 1936 and 1937. This is Nardal, quote, wrenched the great Negro masses out of their indolence and insouciance. With the incursion of the Italians into Abyssinia, she says, a concern for the future of the race has entered into the preoccupations of Negroes. She adds that, quote, signs of the emancipation of thinking, or as the communists would say, critical thought, were appearing in certain colonies. What's fascinating about these writings is that Nardal argues that the Italo-Ethiopian crisis catalyzed an unprecedented level of internationalist consciousness among Black populations around the world. Again, this is Nardal from one of the series, the articles in the series. Nardal writes, under the brutal shock of events, the Black populations scattered around the world, which yesterday were so indifferent to one another, have abruptly discovered a common soul in the common defense of Ethiopia. Many of them might not be able to say exactly where Ethiopia is located, but they know what it is to them, an independent parcel of the great lost fatherland, whose misfortune has awoken a secret nostalgia in them. The mysterious link of race, which suddenly brings all the colonized Blacks, as loyalist, assimilated, conformist as they may be, closer to these quote-unquote savages. Wrong or right, she goes on, Negroes see that in that millennial empire, the justification of that entirely natural feeling that is racial pride and not arrogance, from which they've been so long deprived. In this regard, one must recall the degree to which Black elites have been held by the Negro-American racial renaissance, whose promoters carried the slogan, "We are different but not inferior." Nardal's argument is not exceptional in itself. As I've written elsewhere, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, even more than Spanish Civil War, the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, or the second Joe Louis-Max Schmeling fight in June 1938, was arguably the single event in the period that most popularly inflamed the imagination of Blacks throughout the world. As an attack on the very principle of Black sovereignty at a time when the great majority of peoples of the African diaspora lived under colonial domination. In the United States, almost overnight, the great historian John Hope Franklin famously observed, quote, even the most provincial among the American Negroes became international-minded. A few years later, Roy Ottley, the writer, observed that, quote, from the beginning, the Ethiopian crisis became a fundamental question in Negro life. It was all but impossible for Negro leaders to remain neutral, and the position they took toward the conflict became a fundamental test. The survival of the Black nation became the topic of angry debate in pool rooms, barbershops, and taverns, Ottley says. In Nardal's writings, however, there's something like the beginnings of a shift in her own political consciousness. She admits, again, this is one of these same articles, I'd always believed that the form of the political regime of the conquering nation should remain indifferent to colonized peoples until the point when the latter had attained the level of civilization as the same level of civilization as their metropoles. But the current events have shown me my error, as colonized peoples are at once the stakes and the victims of the struggle among three political regimes that today are disputing the hegemony of the world, that is, fascism, Bolshevism, and democracy. In 1932, the Jamaican writer Claude McKay wrote a letter from Tangier to Nancy Cunard, who was in the process of gathering material for her monumental Negro anthology. McKay recommended that Cunard contact Nardal in France, saying that she could be useful in gathering material, but adding with McKay's usual brusque humor, quote, I do not know if I have to specify that you had better not hold too leftist a language. Nardal was famously, if you're not familiar with her work, famously conservative and Catholic. in the religious sense. But Nardal's writing about the Italo-Ethiopian War are documentation of a political mind in flux, not in the throes of conversion either, I don't want to overstate it, but in a serious grappling with what she termed the psychological repercussions of Marxism among populations of African descent. Needless to say, if you know Nardal's work, this is an unexpected Nardal. The question is, how does one translate this work in a way that preserves its open-ended, searching quality? Let me give you a little bit more, just one more passage of a sampling of this newly bold Nardal. It's another of these essays about Ethiopia. The African diasporic sense of justice is highly developed, she says, and it's not troubled by sophisms. In one of the meetings organized in Paris by the Negro associations in support of Ethiopia, I heard an orator say, "Ethiopia must be given to Italy because Italy is suffocating." Very well. If so, I do not see why, in France, poor families with numerous children living in cramped and unhealthy housing do not say to those who are in better circumstances, "I don't have enough space at home. You've got plenty of unused rooms and you don't have children. So I'm moving in with you. And I'm going to seize everything you have, to which I would likewise afford a real utility." Such reasoning, Nardal says, is in itself irrefutable. It's this sense of justice that has all the black populations of the world standing at Ethiopia's side. I don't mean to make it sound as though these articles mark some full-throated embrace of Marxism with no caveats or hesitation. She does say that she's not convinced by what she terms, interestingly, the Marxist formation, or use of the word formation, because formation in French also means education in the Bildung sense of formation. She does try to take a step back from the Marxist formation. Nevertheless, she concludes, the Marxist formation may afford to Negroes, she argues, possibly in a quicker manner than any other intellectual discipline, some of the qualities still lacking among the masses to ensure their continued evolution: the taste for method, the acceptance of discipline, the sense of reality, the spirit of decision, in a word, the dynamism necessary for its indispensable evolution. In this sense, the task of the translator is to preserve the opacity of the fluctuation in a historical problem space, defined, and this is from David Scott, my colleague's work, defined as an ensemble of questions and answers around which a horizon of identifiable stakes, conceptual as well as ideological political stakes, hangs. There's an opacity to that fluctuation because the stakes of any given problem space are continually in dispute and shift over time in subtle and unpredictable ways. In following the argument of scholars such as David Kazanjian for a method not simply informed by historicist perspective, but also attentive to how speculative modes of thought appear in our historical archives, I'm struggling as I prepare English versions of these articles, and we've decided to publish this book as only seems fitting à la Nardal. If you've read La Revue du Monde Noir, that means facing pages English-French translations. I've been struggling as I'm trying to figure out how to render her words in English in a manner that respects their speculative, self-questioning, even inchoate qualities. What does formation mean to her, and how do you carry that over? These opacities must be preserved if we want to be able to track the shifts in her political thinking that do not ever harden into anything as solid as stances or tendencies. Coincidentally, I've been spending a lot of time in this era lately. My second example also comes from the 1930s, now on the verge of, rather than the aftermath of the Italo-Ethiopian conflict. The translation I published a little more than a year ago of Michel Leiris's monumental and unclassifiable 1934 book, Phantom Africa, composed in the form of diary entries over the course of Leiris's work as the secretary archivist on the Mission Dakar-Djibouti, the infamous state-sponsored French anthropology expedition that traversed the African continent between 1931 and 33. Here's one of the clearest echoes. In 2016, the writer and translator John Keane published a much discussed manifesto on the Poetry Foundation blog Harriet titled Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, in which he makes a forceful argument that, quote, we need more translation of literary works by non-Anglophone Black diasporic authors into English, particularly by US-based translators. I wholeheartedly agree, and I'd say that this has been the driving commitment between much of my other work as a translator, of work by writers including Aimé Césaire, Glissant, Soni Laboutansi, and Monchoachi. But I feel strongly that we need to be able to stake a claim to the core of the Western literary tradition as well, especially when it's a matter of monumental works by white writers grappling so directly with the place of Africa and Africans in the world. Given the triangulation that brought Leiris from a dilettante's fascination with African-American jazz in Paris in the 1920s to the Mission Dakar Djibouti and the African continent in 1931, it seems only appropriate that an African-American translator should bring L'Afrique Fantôme into English. Turnabout is fair play. Having spent so much time with the book, I've thought a great deal about what it means for an African-American translator to render this particular volume into English. As a scholar whose work focuses especially on the emergence of Black radical thought in circuits of exchange and translation among African diasporic intellectuals and artists in the Americas, in Europe, and in Africa, I've also pondered the significance of translating a renegade classic that is the inimitable product of the fraught interface between European anthropology and colonialism. Translating Phantom Africa made me keenly conscious of the degree to which the entire Mission Dakar Djibouti was itself an enormous translation exercise, undertaken in the service of that complicity between anthropology and colonialism. And I came to the conclusion that to underline and undermine that complicity, it was crucial for my translation to preserve and set in relief, mettre en évidence, the role of translation in the expedition, to translate for translation, as it were, to translate in a manner attentive to the traces of antecedent mediation and thus multiplicity, in the Glissantian sense, embedded in the source text. In rereading my translation, I've come to realize that in my introduction, I was too dismissive when I wrote that Leiris has little to say in the book about the Africans who served as translators for the mission. On the contrary, some of the most nuanced portraits in Leiris's journal are his discussions of the African interpreters who accompanied the Mission Dakar Djibouti. They're not intimidated or subservient, but complexly human, sometimes mercurial or truculent, and often erudite. Leiris dwells, for instance, on the... Oh. Is it still up there? No.
Oh, it was.
Ah, the resilience of Apple. Is it there?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's purple.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that won't happen again. Leiris dwells, for instance, on the warm and lighthearted atmosphere. These photos are not reproduced in the book. These are from the archive. There's an enormous archive of thousands of, basically the core of the collection of the Musée du Quai Branly, the old Musée du Trocadéro, Musée de l'Homme has become the colonial, the ethnographic collection of the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. The core of it, thousands of items come from the Mission Dakar Djibouti, and there are a lot of records from the Mission. So none of these photos are in his book. Yes. Is it there?
It's kind of a strange purpley hue.
Well, I hope you'll get to see them. You saw one. See if it'll stay. He dwells in one entry on the warm and light-hearted atmosphere in the compound of the Mission Dakar Djibouti. One evening when their Senegalese interpreter and assistant Mamadou Vade, that's Mamadou Vade, there are a number of photos in the collection where they have the interpreters, they have the translators pose with the artifacts that they're collecting, buying, or in some cases stealing. So he's wearing a ritual hat that is going to become part of the collection that goes to the Quai Branly. But they have the interpreters try out and wear the things that they're taking back. These artifacts are really interesting and complicated. Mamadou Wade is a former railroad mechanic who worked on the expedition for 4 months in the summer, fall of 1931. Léris writes this particular day, he rises with his freshly shaven head from the mat where he has been stretched out and scrupulously records some good story in Wolof, translated not only into French but also into the Arabic script. These guys were multilingual and incredibly erudite in the little notebook that Griol gave him. Earlier that day, in the car of the Mission, Mamadou Wade tells dazzling, Léris says, and humorous anecdotes. Léris recounts, in Calles, going to fetch some milk, Mamadou Wade surprised a man copulating with his cow. Ever since, when Mamadou runs into him, he asks, how's your wife? Even in this minor example, over the course of a single day, what is notable is the complex dynamic between work and play. If some of the stories Wade records and translates for the team might fall under the instrumental task of collecting information for ethnographic purposes, some clearly do not. There's obvious affection in the way Léris habitually describes the interpreters and informants working with the Mission, men such as Mamadou Wade, Dusso Woulogem, Ambaradolo, and Ambibe Badiabi. That's Badiabi and Woulogem there, Woulogem on the left. At times they're resourceful, at times they're disinterested, at times they're capricious or recalcitrant. In November 1931, on a day trip to Yugo, Léris records that one of their principal Dogon contacts, Ambaradolo, him, this is Léris's description, as they're going on a day trip, this is one of their porters and translators. People often had multiple jobs with the Mission. Léris says, he's sporting his ever-present earrings, forage cap, black frock coat with green buttons in the back, breeches, and an umbrella. He refuses to carry anything but our storm lantern and the big bundle of personal effects he's wearing, slung over his shoulder, bandolier style, like a peasant returning from the fair in Fouilly-les Oies. Here's Dolo hanging out in a tree one day. The other thing that's really complicated that I won't even talk about except to show you this picture is that a number of the interpreters on the Mission Dakar-Djibouti are children, are adolescents and pre-adolescents. This is one of he's 11 years old, Mamadou Keita. Marcel Griol and Michel Lys are so taken with the linguistic, the talents of this young Malian that Marcel Griol tells him, Mamadou Keita, I want to make you a great ethnographer. And they take this kid with them from Mali for 6 months with the idea of training him, and they actually have him participating in the work. So he's not just translating for them, but he's actually taking notes himself. It's a whole element of this dynamic that's very complicated. It may be worth reflecting on the fact that so many of the enigmatic interactions in Phantom Africa involve the African translators on the Mission. Léris and his fellow ethnographers encounter a good deal of hedging, prevarication, and misdirection on the part of the Africans for whom they attempt to extract information. Even if Léris remains oblivious to their full implications, as he often does, these moments in the book are traces of overt resistance, where the only available strategy for a quote-unquote native informant conscripted into the information-gathering drive of colonial anthropology is silence and opacity. But there's something else going on when the resistance is coming not from the native informant, but instead from the translator. That is emanating from the very factotum who's meant to ensure the linguistic transparency of the native to the anthropological understanding. Given how often it happens in Phantom Africa, we might even need to consider the way the book stages the specific opacity of the translator. The historical character in Phantom Africa that has stuck with me the most, he's really a member of the team, which is why I'm showing you this picture. If you think of the Mission Dakar-Djibouti as just white French anthropologists hanging out in Africa for 2 years. But the one who stuck with me the most is Léris's most important African collaborator during the Ethiopian portion of the Mission, the Eritrean diplomat, former priest, librarian, teacher, and linguist, Abba Jerome, there, the third from the right. 2 decades older than Leiris, Abba Jerome was a highly accomplished yet self-effacing intellectual whose career has been lamentably eclipsed because he published very little during his lifetime. He played a crucial role as a representative of Haile Selassie after World War I during multiple diplomatic missions to Europe, helping especially to negotiate the conditions under which Ethiopia would be admitted to the League of Nations in 1923. It's really crucial in terms of the international circuits of Ethiopian diplomacy in that era. I'm almost done. A couple more words about him. There's not time to reflect in depth on their collaboration or to give you a full portrait of Abba Jerome. I'll just include a few words from his tribute, from Leiris's tribute to his old colleague. It was written for a Festschrift, edited just before Abba Jerome's death at the age of 103. He retired and then moved to France and taught for another 20 years in France, taught Amharic. Without Abba Jerome's role as an initiator and go-between during Leiris's research with the possession cult he was working with, the Tsar possession cult in Gondar, Ethiopia, Leiris says, the Tsar, this possession cult, might have remained for him nothing more than a cold object of study. To Leiris, the women and men around Malcolm Ayahu, the priestess who runs this cult, became less ethnographic informers than Leiris says, friends or relatives to whom I was attached, at least in some cases, and going by my own, perhaps unilateral impressions, by a strong affective bond. He describes the time he and Abba Jerome spent living largely at Malcolm Ayahu's house as research that was less a procedure undertaking in a scientific spirit than an impassioned attempt to find out what was going on in the heads of these people, women for the most part, whose words and modes of action fascinated us. That's Abba Jerome with one of the possessed women, Emma Awish, who Leiris is, I think, infatuated would be the right verb, and her son, Emma Awish's son, in the Missions camp in 1932. In one of the entries in Phantom Africa, Leiris remembers, he had described Abba Jerome as, quote, a man with a poetic instinct for information, which is to say a feeling for the apparently insignificant detail that puts everything into context and gives a document its stamp of truth. Looking back 50 years later, when he writes in the Festschrift, Leiris muses that, quote, the praise I gave him then strikes me as now as all too timid. It still considered him from the angle of ethnographic practice rather than that of poetry. Abba Jerome was a man with a deep literary sensibility, Leiris concludes, in a way that went deeper and beyond the practicalities of his collaboration in the research. The element of Phantom Africa where I feel this self-consciousness about my role as a translator had a palpable impact on the form of the English version is something I discuss in a section of my introduction. Translating the book, I sensed a resonance between my labor and that of the African interpreters who played such a key part in the entire Mission Dakar Djibouti. Their scrupulous mediation preceded mine and in a sense formed the foundation of the enterprise. I was determined throughout to listen for their presence as they patiently ferried language not their own. I realized that Leiris, in his obsession with immediacy, repeatedly elides the presence of the African interpreters around him with a sly grammatical contortion. He uses passive formulations, such as lui font dire. So at one point he says, our hosts have him told not to get so upset. Lui font dire de ne pas s'en faire à ce point. The formulation is at once a way of indicating the mediation of translation and a way of eliding the agency of the translator. Grammatically speaking, the interpreter is almost but not quite present in the sentence. The phrase in French, lui font dire, means literally, they have it said to him, or have him told. The lui, that pronoun is the only place where the interpreter shows up. They have the interpreter tell him not to get so upset in the sentence I just read, but the sentence doesn't actually specify who's doing the telling. In response, I decided both to describe this elision in my introduction and to keep, wherever I could, the translators in view in the English version, adding brief contextual phrases. For example, I would add, instead of just have it said or have him told, I would add, have it said through the interpreter, or have the translator explain, to highlight the agency of linguistic mediation. This is a small thing, admittedly. It's another pursuit of phantoms, one might say. But it was my quiet way of retaining the traces of translation within Leiris's text. and in this sense, my way of doing justice to the legacy of Black translators, too. My way of keeping Dussault Wologem and Abba Jerome from slipping out of sight. Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes or so for questions for two fantastic papers.
Gary, do you have permission to put on my novelist hat for a moment?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Or a mic.
Those were just gorgeous papers, both of them. I don't have a question, or maybe I do. Maybe you can help me out later. Maybe I'm just asking a therapeutic one, but you can tell me later. So I published a novel earlier this year, and I didn't publish it in the U.S. I sought a publisher out of the U.S. and outside England as well, although it is written in English. Precisely because I was dealing with some of the questions that you raised in your talk, Kayama, which is that I'm writing about a Pakistani woman in the 70s. I wrote about a Pakistani woman in the 70s who was in a bad marriage. But it's also a novel about time and art, and it's and about what it is to write a domestic novel, and which is an anti-marriage plot novel, and a novel that's not a Bildungsroman. Right? So there's all of that going on there. But I knew at some very deep level that that would become just about an oppressed Muslim woman here. But at the same time, there was something else going on as well. That I didn't want to write an English novel from South Asia, or from South Asian, that was in a kind of pidgin, that it was comic. It was a very serious, it was about 19th century, a 19th century Urdu phone culture. And the best compliment that somebody gave me was that they could hear the Urdu cadences in the English, right, in Karachi. But what was interesting about some of the, and what I'm grappling with, and what both your papers are helping me think through, right, as an academic as well, and as a scholar, is of course that I cross that back and forth. And I can't think about the novel outside, as not a scholar, right? But at the same time, so now suddenly, because it's doing reasonably well in India, should I bring it in the US? And there's some independent press that's looking at it. And on the one hand, I want it here because I live here and I have friends like John Keane, who blurbed the book and whom I admire greatly, to read it. On the other hand, I'm terrified of bringing it here, right? And that is about all kinds of translation. It's about whether you can do it in English, but it's also about what it means to publish a book about a Muslim woman, even though the novel is about everything but that in some ways, right? Here. And so part of what both of you raised in different ways was, right, do you then translate the half-translated English book that you wrote in English? I do actually have Urdu script in it that I don't translate, by actually adding your own introduction to the book, right? Not by Edwidge Danticat or some sort of big name writer, but like, how do you actually publish here? Right? And that is an ideological act of translation. So, I mean, it's a question, but it's also a comment, but it's also like, thank you for saying what you said, because it helps me think it through.
Maybe what we'll do is stack a couple of questions.
Thank you so much for both of the presentations. I wanted to ask about, so I was thinking about the essay that both presentations mentioned, Keane's essay on translating Blackness, which I think one thing that's interesting about the essay is that there's a kind of slippage where translating Blackness then becomes translating Black culture, and then Blackness becomes a cultural category as opposed to other understandings of what Blackness could be. There's a discussion out there now about Blackness or race as, which is not reducible to Blackness either, but as infrastructure or as something that isn't, say, strictly cultural. And I guess I raised the question because there's also a discussion happening now about, and I think that it's happening in the in this conference implicitly too, is trying to think translation beyond the strict sense of linguistic translation, but also beyond just what Balibar describes as like the culturalist emphasis on translation, where if it's not linguistic, it's cultural. And so we can talk about, and we have talked about, philosophical translation, translation across times. And so in a sense, it's kind of an invitation to think, could translating blackness, taking into consideration both of those discussions, both translation not just as culturalist, blackness not as immediately exclusively black culture, if it would be worth thinking about. It's an open question, yep.
Maybe just one more, and then I'll give them a chance to respond.
Yeah, Kayana, this is for you. Aside from all the issues you mentioned, did you get the impression, although I may be giving these publishers too much intelligence and knowledge, that there was a particular bias against Haiti? Because not only was Haiti black, but because of the Haitian Revolution, the whole history that complicates, kind of the democratic role of France and the United States, and so on.
Is that enough?
I'm sure that's more than enough. But for now.
I'll answer the last one quickly.
Go ahead, sure.
So I can answer that pretty quickly, and to be very fair, no, that didn't seem to be an issue of resistance to translating a Haitian novel per se, but I would argue somehow on the other end of perhaps a continuum that involves that, a cautiousness about translating Haiti, or a cautiousness about publishing a Haitian novel. And I can, they only tell you so much. And, but I can say that I sensed personally a wariness that had to do perhaps with the contemporary moment and what has been happening with Haiti in the last 10 years, let's say. So, yeah. But not a fear of Haiti in the way that you're suggesting, yeah.
You want to say stuff about the other stuff, or should I? It was a lot.
It was a lot.
Let's see. I mean, I didn't talk about my publisher because I didn't have quite the traumatic history of seeking a publisher. The publisher actually approached me and asked me, did you ever want to translate something? And I said, yeah, this 720 pages. Then I'd somehow had forgotten it was 720 pages. I said, yeah, this book, Phantom Africa. Seagull Books, so it's actually a South Asian publisher. Seagull is based in Calcutta. They're distributed through University of Chicago Press. So they have a US distribution route, but there are other paths into a global or into a world Anglophone, quote unquote, sort of context. Yeah, and so that was how my translation of Leiris was placed. One thing I'd say about our two projects, the Phantom Africa and the De Pestre novel, that maybe we didn't highlight but is worth mentioning, is that part of the conundrum that you're dealing with is proposing a translation of a historical text. Now, you almost had it harder because mine, 50 years earlier, could enter the classic, that category of the classic, the never translated monumental classic of French anthropology, whereas De Pestre, being still alive, and that particular novel is late 80s, it's not that far away, but it's not what he's doing right now. It almost gets you in a more complicated place because the publisher is thinking, well, this is not current, this isn't up to date. So that's part of what I'd respond, that the question of translating historical works is a particular question that we have both had to negotiate. My answer to you, and I can think of many examples, one who comes to mind immediately is a friend but a former student at Columbia. She has a PhD, Valeria Luiselli, who's a Mexican novelist but now lives in New York. she's now written a novel about recent child migrants from Latin America, but just before that she wrote what was originally an essay in Freeman's in the Journal in English, and then her Mexican publisher asked her to self-translate into Spanish, and she started self-translating, and she rewrote the entire thing into a book that was 3 times longer than the original essay, and then she got someone else to retranslate it back into English, into a book called Tell Me How It Ends, that won the American Book Award last year. I don't know if that's what transcreation. No, to me, it's back to that question of what does transcreation mean. It's maybe not as simple as write your thing in the quote-unquote home language and self-translate as though you have the fully packaged thing, and then you move it into another language. Maybe transcreation means the possibility of, in this interlingual space, if you have the flexibility of working with fluency in multiple languages, to find creative potential in the dissonance between languages. So Valeria found gaps and holes and things to add, and some of it was translation-based. Like, there's not a word, you can't really say performance in Spanish. You know, there were difficulties or opacities in moving from one language to another that forced her to figure out things that if she just stayed in one language, she wouldn't have had to think through. So it became fruitful. I don't know if this is what transcreation meant in your case study, but to me, it's a really interesting definition of something that I'd call bilingual or multilingual transcreativity. I'm not suggesting that you should do that unless that's a space that you want to occupy, but that's one way to think about. You don't have to only publish in one place, and the book doesn't have to be the same book as you showed us this morning.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you. It's actually inspiring.
I would just add logistically to that also, just in terms of an adamant and heartfelt, yes, you can publish here in the US. The story I told was like a tragedy, but it wasn't. It was a happy ending. And what I meant to articulate also was just that there's work to be done in tandem with a publisher. I mean, what I was sharing earlier about the publisher that kind of just let voodoo slip in there because it had a nice ring to it was very different from the publisher I ended up working with. It took some doing to find, but those publishers certainly exist. It's just a matter of, on your own end, being wary and cautious and figuring out at the very outset, obviously, what's going to be allowable in terms of your level of involvement in the mediation process, which is the packaging of your work, right? And working with someone who's sensitive to not just the language but the context, right, that you're talking about. So.
Can I say one other thing, just quickly about it's a big issue that we're not going to be able to exhaust, but let me try to say it quickly. The John Keane essay. The other category that's floating in that essay is the category of the Black translator. So not books that are about Blackness and the relation between Blackness and Black culture, but the fact of the person doing the work of mediating as being, and this is something I was saying, I've been thinking about a lot. Does it make a difference, and what claim can I make theoretically that it makes a difference in terms of the status of the translator? There aren't very many, I don't think I'm surprising anyone in the room, there aren't very many African-American translators of anything. John Keane, Rowan Ricardo Phillips, I don't think we'd get very far if we tried to put together a list. Although I understood what you said, and I have a real sympathy for some of the arguments in that vein, the one that I would say I find most convincing is Fred Moten's argument about a kind of para-ontological distinction between Blackness and Blacks, between Blackness as a category that he associates with fugitivity and peoples of African descent as a demographic category. I wouldn't want to get into a policy of promoting Blackness beyond Black people. We can all get some. There is, back to the first thing I said, there is a real politics of representation, just as there's a politics of representation being a faculty member in a university, in a higher education institutions in the US. Bodies matter, and it matters having people of color in those seats. And in that sense, just on a representational politics side, just on that side of things, it matters representationally to have peoples of African descent translating. So I can't pull away from an awareness of that representational politics to the extent where I can move blackness away from black people entirely. But it's a very hard question. That's the quickest I can say it. It's a really hard question.
So maybe just as a final question, and I think it sort of intersects with that. I mean, one of the things that struck me in both papers, although you talked about it slightly differently, kind of in terms of the notion of world literature and the one text from any particular country, and Brent, your notion of, I mean, thinking about Glissant and all the languages of the world. And I just wonder what the relationship between those two things might be. I mean, sort of English seems outside, right? Like all of world literature has to be translated into English for consumption by an Anglophone audience. And sometimes I think the notion is all the languages of the world, right, are outside of, I'm not saying that's what Glissant meant, right? But it seems that that's a market factor in translation, right? That these things have to be brought into English. And does that affect this notion of a lack of African-American translators, right? I mean, because we're meant to be receiving. I mean, because Keen's also asking, I think specifically, right, for African-American translators, if I'm remembering that right.
He mentions women as well, right? And
but not like African diaspora, African-American translators of world literature into English, right?
yeah, it's funny, in your talk, at the point when you said one of, it was funny that much of Glissant's work on translation hasn't been translated. And then I realized that I was kind of automatically putting the rest of the sentence as into English onto that, right?
Yeah.
So despite what we might want or know to be desirable, yes is the answer to that. There is a way in which we absolutely think about English as being the center language into which, in order to truly be global and legible, something must be translated. So, and I made the point myself, right, talking about the fact that DePestre's novel, it has been translated into 7 other languages, and yet there's something about the English that I felt was a true injustice for some reason, but I certainly could have said, well, if you can read any number of these other languages, that book is already out there. So I don't know, there's the ideal, obviously, and then there's the practical and the real. The strength of the American publishing institution in particular does mean that to arrive on a global stage, one does desire oftentimes to pass through America, right? So yeah.
Yeah, Glissant, I mean, obviously the market forces, and this is something that people like Larry Venuti write about very powerfully, the market forces are what they are. The other side of that irony is that in terms of the percentage of the publishing market, the US actually publishes much less in translation than
2%.
many, just to stick with Western Europe, than many other countries. Glissant was very aware of these paradoxes, but ironically, in terms of what I was quoting, Glissant wasn't really worried about that, and what he was talking about French. He was saying, and he would joke about that, how poorly, after however many years he lived in the U.S., he spoke English not so well. And so when he was saying, I only speak French, unfortunately, there's a thing at Columbia, we should all New York conglomeration, multiple events at the same time. Kelito is speaking at Columbia, who, of course, I was just reading his amazing book, I Speak All Languages But in Arabic. Je parle toutes les langues mais en arabe. And there are multiple versions of this kind of thinking multilingualism, this kind of argument, coming from Karen's work also. Yeah, Karen's work in the Greek context. So to me, it's an exciting conversation, but it's not, despite the perversities of the global publishing market, Glissant doesn't mean that we're all always on my way to English. He's saying, hey, I only speak French and I can hardly make my way. I can hardly buy groceries in English. In any case, yeah, there's much more to say about this issue.
I think Gary wants
holding
us,
the mic.
I think Gary wants us to stop you
Either
to
wants
ask
to
a
say-
question.
I mean, I had a quick.
Maybe both of you really quickly.
Okay,
and then we'll-
we can let them marinate. You don't have to answer. One, I had a comment and a quick question for each of you. The comment was that trying to knit things together, it strikes me both of you are echoing what we heard in certainly Fadi's presentation, and also last night in Bashir's, and in the brief bit I talked about that chain from Marx to Lenin to, Raya and James, that any given translation, if you look closely enough, is not this static relation between an original and a source, but it's like one captured moment in this long train of translations. And that just seems worth remembering and holding on to. Maybe a little less in the past, but you said he was already translating Haiti for France, and so I think that's important when we think about the politics of translation and the practice of translation. I just wanted to go back to the original amazing Glissant quote, Brent, you started with. We write in the presence of all the languages of the world. So the first question was for Kayama. You didn't speak, I know you will in your bigger project, about the relationship between a novel like this, the Pest novel, and his travels, his internationalism, his internationalist commitments. So I wonder what he would say about writing in the presence of all the languages of the world, and whether you felt anything like that echo in this peculiar novel. And Brent, your amazing attention to these layers, your predecessors and the presence and the traces and the, really active, you say traces, but they seem quite present, just made invisible in a certain way of your predecessor translators. That seemed maybe, there was a way in which their multilingualism suggested that they were already inhabiting or speaking in relation to all the languages of the world. But I was struck for your case by that other amazing bit in there, which is, I deport my own tongue. And I wondered whether you felt in your practice of speaking through and with these other translators, whether that resonated. I deport my own tongue. That seemed powerful. But we can hear from Susan.
And I just
Whether or not you
had the same desire to pull some strands together, and a little differently though, but because it's quite fascinating, the wonderful papers, and they bring a whole new sensibility to the task, and maybe one that's rather hopeful. So I'm going back to Fadi's notion of having to translate quickly and not worrying about whether it was exactly right or not. And then I'm thinking of my former colleague Ben Anderson saying that Marx was translated by Thais in Thailand who were in prison, and they happened to be poets. So Marx in Thai is extremely poetic. So these kinds of accidental things. But last night, when we spoke about the Mahmoud Moon translation movement into the Abbasid dynasty of Arabic, and taking it from the Syriac, which had come from the Koine, which people call Greek. That was also an appropriation. These houses of wisdom were appropriations by power of all knowledge in the language that they could understand, right? And that it seems to me that what is so hopeful about your experiences of translation is that it's producing a kind of sensibility for a global, because we're a globalization committee, a global culture that isn't just awful globalization. Yeah, that could be something really quite important for people to be sensitive to.
You guys don't have to answer either. You can. Last line for either.
What's happening?
You want to answer?
I will very
We want to keep the
quickly
conversation
admit something.
going, and we also
This will be a short response then, very simple, and maybe it will address both what you're both asking, commenting, which is simply to say, or maybe not at all, but as a translator, there is a weird existence on two sides of this line, wherein it's just a humble task to take a novel and make it readable by people other than the original readership. And that's very much what I try to do when I want to translate this novel. And there is on your shoulder also an immense and hubristic task, which is to change the world and to make people see things differently by how well or not you've done your job as a translator. And that's what I was trying to get at with the paper, which is, yeah, you can translate Vodou as voodoo, you can translate carnival and just make it, well, yes, legible, but you can also go into it with a true desire to create new space for seeing what's inside of this text. And quickly or with great care or time, I think the intention is what does matter, and you hope that it's visible. So,
yeah, quickly, glissant, I didn't get into it, but glissant's key term in theorizing translation is renunciation.
yeah.
It says translation is fugue, which is a pretty way of saying renunciation. When I translate, I renunciate. And it's connected to that idea of I deport my own tongue. It's a very... Abandon, yeah, it's a very powerful idea, and it goes in that direction. One other thing, going back to the previous panel,
Can I just say quickly?
Yeah.
But we believe we can do it when we're doing it. I mean, I just want to, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of talking about translation, and this, to your point about the dangers versus the possibilities. Like, we are starting from the belief that we can do it, and that's incredibly naive and optimistic, but necessary to not be, completely inert or incapable of moving forward with a translation project. We do believe it can happen, and that might be hubristic in and of itself, but it's necessary.
You're not renouncing
right, just to say.
the belief that you can do it, but you're renouncing some of the old-fashioned cliches. You're renouncing the idea of fidelity. You're abandoning, in a certain sense, certain aspects that you can't pull over. Just going back to, this does relate to going back to Gavin and Fadi, it seemed to me that part of what was swirling around there that didn't quite come to the surface, but I've been thinking all day, when we use the word translation, are we actually talking about the same term? And I'm not always sure, although sometimes we're using it as though we're talking about the same process or the same stakes of the same practice. Maybe it's worth highlighting a little more clearly the ways we differ in understanding what translation practice is. If you're translating between competing universals, to me the point is that you're implicitly moving beyond a source-target model. It's not about the fidelity from the original to the translation. It's some process, and you could call it something else. You could call it mediation or negotiation. It's produced in a third space, which isn't started with Gramsci and it was translated into Spanish or into whatever, or the other way around, but the meeting between those competing universal has to produce a discourse in another space, which I'm not sure translation is the right word for that. But to call it a translation as getting beyond source target model is really interesting. Similarly, in Fadi's presentation, that you're translating into Arabic from English and French translations. You're translating Marx or translating Gramsci is really interesting. It's the one thing, the task of the translator. One thing Benjamin says that it always bothered me. He says, you can't translate a translation. I was like, why not? And what Fadi was telling us, I think, was that in that respect, it also is about producing this third space. It's rethinking the politics of mediation, that there's something enabling in that renunciation, pulling away from the idea of a fidelity to what's going on in Gramsci's Italian or what's going on in Marx's German. I can get there, not fidelity, but I can get where I need to go, and it allows me a space to reinvent what Marx needs to mean for me by going through English to get to the Arabic version of the translation. And that creativity that opens up in that third space, it didn't quite come out articulately, but I thought that was one of the most important thinkings toward redefining translation that we've been doing today. Well, it's what I'm going to take home, for part of what I'm going to take home. Thank you.